6. Man is the measure of all things. When such a belief becomes a dogma, an article of faith which dominates an epoch, and is regarded as needing no further proof, but is rooted firm in the human unconscious, no man can draw wholly clear of its power. Every single person in this epoch bears this belief within him, and acts accordingly. It is important to establish this, for, according to the description already given, the leveling of authority and value divided men into two camps, and they stood apart like enemies, and later began fighting. And it was only in the course of the fight that the hierarchy broke down. There were questioner and questionee, son and father, layman and parson, defendant and judge, patient and doctor, uneducated and educated, and finally the poor and the rich. There were people who stood for the old order and fought for it, and in the political sense were therefore conservatives. And there were people who represented the new and fought for it, and were therefore in the political sense revolutionaries. And the externals of the process, which we see and experience all about us, correspond to this picture in black and white. The stage of time and history ever displays some men standing at the barricades, and others being led to the scaffold. The external picture, however, does not correspond to the inner essence of the process. The doctrine that man is the measure of all things has gripped not only that part of mankind which is raising Old Harry against the other part, it has gripped the whole of mankind, and thus every single human being is questioner and questionee, fighter and fought, conqueror and conquered at one and the same moment. This internal picture presents a paradox, for it would mean that ultimately it is the same man who, in the intoxication of liberty, rips off the vestments and trappings of authority, in order to level out himself and fall stripped and naked into the lostness of a universe which can find no place for him. It would mean that the father, the parson, the judge, and the rich man are desperately defending themselves against the levelers with one part of their being, while the other part is supporting the attack. It would imply a man having split himself symbolically into two, each half fighting to the knife within his breast. Yet that is precisely the inner picture of the process which is revealing itself today. Observe, for instance, that a man as father reacts passionately to his son's lack of respect, that as a magistrate he invokes the full penalty of the law, rejecting the humane appeal of the defendant's counsel, and as a man of substance resists all efforts designed to reduce his wealth. As a father, a magistrate, and a rich man, this man is a representative of the old authority, a conservative standing on the other side of the barricade and fighting desperately to maintain his position. But he will only be attacked as the representative of authority. Elsewhere he himself becomes the cross-examiner, and mends the barricades. We need not advert to the banal case of a man supporting those who launch their assaults against other fathers, judges, and rich men, although it is common enough. Let us suppose the man is logically consistent as father, magistrate, and rich man, and as a matter of principle opposes rebellion against authority in these regions. Nonetheless, there are other areas where he marches with the rebels. He may have spiritual, artistic, or literary interests. He admires certain plays, advocates a certain musical movement, buys pictures of a certain genre, or reads with pleasure modern books. Beyond the narrow area where he represents authority are tastes and interests among which he can move freely. Here he will often be found among the rebels ripping authority from representatives of the arts. He does not realize that in so doing he is attacking his own position, inasmuch as authority is a whole. But the unconscious depths of his being have absorbed the doctrine of the age, and thus he is really like a man passionately flaying himself and just as passionately defending himself against his flail, a paradoxical process characteristic today of man as a split being. So long as the conflict remains unconscious, however, it may possess some value, since the man is but the instrument of a development stronger than himself. Should the division emerge into consciousness, it becomes false and cynical. Then we have the domestic authoritarian who indulges in license away from home, the magistrate who passes stern judgments on the bench, and often laughingly concedes the injustice of his pronouncements, or the rich man who makes himself cheap with his free functions and tastes. It is important to call attention to the inner division because the external picture of the fight against authority suggests an urge from below upwards, a rebellion from the depths against the hierarchy. The fact that every man is swept into the rebellion, the representatives of authority being equally split in themselves, forces us to ask just where the roots of the development lie, where its causes are to be sought. We have already said that it is something positive and valuable, the yearning for genuine values, the search for true authority which challenges the existing authority. The existing authority seems no longer to afford the peace and security needed to provide men with a sense of happiness and well-being. A change has taken place at the top of the hierarchy. What is pressing from below upwards is the response to signals coming from above downwards. The first sign of change is to be sought at the peak of the hierarchy. What has happened up there? The representatives of authority have lost their peaceful self-assurance, which was itself directed upwards, and, obtaining its directions from above, transmitted them downwards. Their conduct and bearing are no longer convincingly natural, no longer exclude doubts and questions. They assert their position strongly, because they feel it necessary to do so, but it is precisely this which shows their weakness. I am the father here, they say, I am the bosses, or I've got the money. And it sounds like Louis XIV's declaration, L'État c'est moi. I am the state, but until now they possessed authority only because they were themselves subject to authority and dependent on it. They were in the service of something higher than themselves. Take, for instance, the rich man. His riches were genuinely his own, and no one thought it unjust. But, then, he did not own his riches solely for himself. He was directed by a spirit, a culture, something situated above him and to which he gave reality by his wealth. The more cultural values he created, the more taste and knowledge he acquired, the more impersonal and neutral his wealth became. He had become the instrument of an idea, and despite the fact that he could afford whatever he desired, he was condemned to a certain measure of asceticism, without which no real authority can be established or upheld. Not a few rich men sacrificed their wealth to an ideal, devoted it to the service of the idea. Jealousy and envy on the part of less richly endowed people were excluded even when the man enjoyed his wealth directly. The whole manner of his life was bound up with so many social duties that the common man observed with relief his own comparative freedom. For it is ridiculous to believe that the most select food and fine old wines are independent of a select and fine old culture of stomach and tongue. And it is even more ridiculous to suppose that fine living awakened jealousy among the social classes which lacked the taste for it. On the contrary, they desired to look upwards to a world above them, strange to them, and maybe barred to them, but a source of protection and security, because it carried more responsibility. But the rich man's immediate relationship to authority, his devotion to cultural values and taste, began to wane. How and why this happened need not concern us here. When the rich man used to say, I was able to acquire this Die here or there, this is a genuine Stradivarius, this wine has been lying now 2 decades in my cellar, he was referring to possessions which were values in themselves, and could only be enjoyed socially, and were respected communally. It was therefore a matter of indifference whose property they were. The owner had the care of them and bore the responsibility for them. His immediate relationship with authority begins to weaken the moment the rich man no longer strives to make something better of himself in the world around him, a purpose requiring a consciousness of his own imperfection, based upon the recognition of something above him to which he is subordinate and towards which he must strive. As wealth has a tendency to attract treasures to itself, the rich man who has lost contact with authority will continue to have things of value round him. The Die and the Stradivarius and the wine will remain his. But the direct inward relationship between him and these values has gone. He owns these things because he can afford to own them, but he no longer possesses them inwardly. They have become objects for him, among which, as subject, he wanders proud and self-conscious, whereas previously they were values whereof he was only incidentally the owner and himself but an object of the values. When the upward look and consciousness of dependence begin to fail, the doctrine that man is the measure of all things revives. The rich man no longer acquires valuables for their own sake and for cultural ends, but for his own sake and to assert his personality and his value. I am the owner of a Die. He says. I've got a Stradivarius. My wines are simply marvelous. For what the doctrine that man is the measure of all things generally means in practice is I am the measure of all things. Each individual translates it into personal terms. The rich man, having adopted this doctrine, experiences an intoxicating expansion of liberty and personal power. He is exempt from the burdens and duties, the cares and responsibilities, the cultural training that in earlier times imposed a measure of asceticism upon him. He no longer depends upon authority, and in his independence can enjoy his wealth freely. He is standing at the peak of the hierarchy. And at that same moment he has lost his own authority. He slides down to the level, and, gray and shapeless, the level floods upon him and sweeps him away. "I am the measure of all things," says the rich man, and his neighbor, beside him but no longer under him, puts the counter question, "Why are you the measure of all things? After all, you, too, are only a man." "I am rich," replies the former. "Why are you rich while I am not, since we're both only men?" asks the other. So begins the process of questioning and leveling which ends in the rich man losing his wealth. This process advances swiftly, but not as fast as a summary of it implies. As the representative of authority, wealth has a measure of gravity which maintains its existence even when the spirit has fled. And it is supported by the need and yearning of the lower strata of the hierarchy for authority above. For the existence of such authority gives them a measure of security, and, with it, of liberty. Responsibility is borne by others, and in general there is nothing men welcome more. The poor man does not put his question at once, therefore, and does not put it frivolously either. He is more disposed to believe that everything is still in order at the top. History shows the patience with which, hopeful and uncomprehending, mankind soars and accepts a collapse at the peak of the hierarchy. Only when the collapse is far advanced, and is creating widespread insecurity in the lower strata, does the revolt begin. And generally speaking, this also is staged and directed from above. It is the representatives of authority who fight within their own class for the purification of authority, whose voices are heard thundering below. When the hierarchy is failing, the moment comes when those of its representatives who are troubled by the collapse, and doubt whether they can prevent catastrophe by their own efforts, turn to the lower ranks, where respect for authority continues. Inevitably this convulses such authority as remains below, and serves only to make the collapse worse. The apprentice sorcerer who conjures up these spirits will never be rid of them, and they will finally demand him as a sacrificial victim. The only escape for the better elements at the top is the upward road, that is to say, the road of self-denial and asceticism. Their failure to take it shows that they already bear within them the germ of corruption. At a more advanced stage in the process the rich man grows weary of his wealth, his freedom and independence, and steers open-eyed to destruction. Without any relationship to culture, wealth becomes valueless to its owner. Enjoyment soon leads to boredom, and drives the rich man to extend the frontiers of his freedom ever wider. When in earlier times he brought up a dusty old bottle from his cellar to celebrate it was on a special occasion. Now he perhaps has to bathe in old champagne to persuade himself that he is doing anything out of the ordinary. As a representative of wealth he is certainly always on guard against an assault, but he can no longer throw the whole weight of his personality into the defense. He is split into a man who desires to preserve his wealth and fears nothing so much as the possibility of losing it, and a man who is weary of freedom and unconsciously wills the annihilation of the wealth that sustains it. This second man waves the banner of revolt, and extends its spirit among those below him, as yesterday he taught them to value authority. It is in his drawing room that the ideas of revolt are coined, which will destroy him. At the theater he applauds Figaro and rejoices to see his own hollowness depicted. The intoxication of freedom is brief and treacherous. When men no longer look upward they sink into boredom, and from the dull emptiness of existence, the urge to self-annihilation, the dark desire for death, arises. For those at the peak of the hierarchy it is far more difficult to feel imperfect and dependent and to maintain a consistent effort upwards than for one domiciled on the human lowlands. The representatives of authority, all too easily, confuse themselves with the authority. The works of intellect and culture are gathered around them, the treasure of wealth lies in their coffers, and they can virtually do as they like. Those below show them a respect which rightly belongs to authority itself, but which naturally fastens on its visible representatives. The representatives have only a delegated authority, their task being to mediate the higher values to those below them, but they are easily beset by the temptation expressed in the words of Louis XIV, "L'autorité c'est moi," to say, "I am the measure of all things." It is needless to point out that this autocratic smugness does not correspond to man's nature, since he is an imperfect and developing being. The temptation to self-importance increases with the growth of the hierarchy, in the sense that the spirit is always creating new works which enlarge the cultural realm. The sense of dependence slowly gives way to boastfulness, like Polycrates, all this is subject to me. And the proud awareness of having brought it all to pass closes the upward road. Then begins the descent and the leveling out, and a fearful judgment falls on the representative of authority. The convulsion is most frightful on the heights of humanity, but not confined to them. Authority has a mysterious quality. It is a quietly self-contained power. Anyone who draws near with clean hands notices only the stillness of the power. But if it be touched with unclean hands, a discharge which, like a volcanic earthquake, can shatter the foundations of a whole civilization, ensues. And impurity in this sphere means failure to serve a higher purpose than the self, failure to mediate the values of a culture to those below. When this selfless and impersonal quality is lacking at the top, when man becomes the measure of all things, the great thaw melting of values begins, to end in a flat uniformity. In the great convulsions by which man is seized, and in which he is simultaneously both subject and object, destiny accords him the inestimable blessing of self-deception. He strides with benevolent blindness through these developments, like a sleepwalker across a precipice which cloud mercifully enshrouds. For it is not true that the fight against authority is ended when the level has been reached and the hierarchy swept away. And it is not true that the great dream of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of all men is thereby realized. The level was to bring quiet, but instead has brought disillusionment. The level was to bring peace, but the fight is not yet ended. On the contrary, it is raging harder and more inexorably around man than ever before, and only now enfolds him with all its demonic force. For each one of the new free men and equals is now quite certain that he himself is the measure of all things. So it has been in the whole developing process of the disintegration of the hierarchy. The next lowest gradation has always promptly blossomed after the destruction of the one above, and fallen into the same error. And the closer the process drew to the base of the pyramid, the greater became the number of those who assumed the mantle of feudocracy. On the level, every man has now become smugly autocratic in the measure of all things. Everyone is at one and the same moment both the apex and the base of the pyramid. The level has certainly brought equality, but not liberty, for pinned into the mass of his equals a man's own place has dwindled to the infinitesimal. And in these narrow straits where each man pushes and struggles and in which each single person has to guard and keep the little scrap of authority he has rescued for himself, fraternity has not been realized. Indeed, the battle has only now attained its height, and has become a battle of man against man, a battle of each against all, prosecuted with gruesome cruelty. Under the hiss of authority, it was needless to assert one's own personality, so long as the way upwards through the immediacy of all the grades was not interrupted and caged off. Within this hierarchy each grade, and each person within it, perceived the confirmation of his or herself from above, and as they were grouped together beneath the same authority, no conflict ensued, and each man had his place, and knew to what end he was living. On the level, however, the affirmation of oneself has become cardinal. For each man has to demonstrate to himself and others that he is free and independent, that is to say, he needs confirmation, and it can no longer reach him from above. But his fellow man is in exactly the same position. He, too, is asking for reaffirmation of his own self. And they are unwilling to grant each other this mutual reaffirmation, because in so doing they always surrender a bit of their own authority. And so the individual who a moment ago was the measure of all things, and in the intoxication of liberty perceived a mighty extension of his being, suddenly finds himself in the position of having no one left to reassure him, to tell him who he is, why he is living, and what is the meaning of his existence. It is an extremely painful and shattering experience, and shakes the very foundations of existence. But it is not in any sense an academic matter, such as besets the man who is accustomed to philosophic thinking. It troubles the cinema commissionaire whose coat bears more gold and frogging than a chancellor of state was wont to wear, but who is none the less shoved and hammered, jostled and pushed by the surging crowd, as if he were next to nothing. It troubles the cook who sweatily dishes out his bad meat broths, rinses cups, and makes sure the customers pay. He stands alone in the midst of many who gulp down their broth and throw money on the table, but scarcely notice the man himself. Whence and through whom is man upon the level to obtain confirmation of himself? A return to the old authority is impossible. Only one's fellow creature can give the desired confirmation, and as he will not give it voluntarily, he must be compelled to do so by force. The situation is similar to the one in which Louis XIV coined the astonishing remark, "I am the state." Then one man said it, but on the level millions are motivated by it. Millions of men do struggle for power in order to force others to recognize and confirm their personalities. The course of development which began with questioning authority is not complete with the destruction of authority, but has then only entered the daimonic stage, the battle of all against all, in which man and his fellow man endeavor mutually to destroy each other. The battle necessarily assumes a veiled and secretive form, since everybody refuses to put on the emblems of the old hierarchy, which would present a nice convenient target. The religious, intellectual, political, economic, and social forms of the battle pass, and it presses through into the most private spheres of personality, into the moral and spiritual, into the realm of the individual unconscious. One man pursues another into the most secret chamber of his being, and drags its contents into the daylight of publicity, in order to show that his neighbor has no right to feel equal, let alone superior, while asserting himself in the process. No means of destruction is left untried in the struggle, and every means is permitted. It is now clear that the man on the level has not retained a scrap of the genuine authority from the assault on the hierarchy, but has assumed that outmoded and collapsed kind of smug autocracy which can be affirmed and secured only by force. In so doing he has assumed the destiny of the upper grades of the hierarchy to whose destruction he contributed, and is himself going on to meet his fate. 8. If things remained as they seem when the level has been reached, one could only say that the revolution ushered in by the question about man will probably end with the annihilation of the human species. It created a world in which people stand against people, man against man, in which every man has to fight, regardless of all else, to gain power, and in which no man hesitates to employ power, just as regardless, against his fellow man, in which the air has been foully infected with evil rumors and slanders, with calumny and suspicion, and in which man's value is ever more rapidly sinking to a level beneath that of the animal creation. In the course of this development two most important modifications have occurred, which might be regarded as fate's tragic irony, if there were not manifestly a deeper significance in them. At some point the phenomenon of authority is transformed into the phenomenon of power, which has manifested itself most forcibly upon the level. The farther down authority sinks, the more clearly does it change into power. And the more generally the doctrine that man is the measure of all things is accepted, the lower does the value of man fall, until it approaches the level of absolute zero. Power becomes the sole visible and accepted value. The level is the cradle of Tsarism. In it are born Tsars, who suddenly raise themselves above the tumult of the marketplace and offer the masses the spectacle of a brief bitter struggle until one finally triumphs and, as a blazing star, begins his lonely trajectory across the firmament. It is an error to evaluate the Caesars highly, however, for theirs is always a domination over nothing, over the chaos of nihilism, only raised upon the rubble and ruins of the human image. Man is no longer elated by what he has won, but is gradually beginning to notice what he has lost through the destruction of the old order. It is not a question of things material or social merely. Many inescapable problems now arise which once seemed firmly settled. Children are born and must be brought up. How are they to be trained? The sexes find the way to meet. How are they to treat each other? How are marriages to be managed, and what is to be the basis of the family? The old rules and conventions have broken down. Should one let one's children grow up wild? Should one advocate free love, and relegate marriage in the family to the rubbish heap? Or should one seek out new regulations and conventions? And other problems crop up. Those relating to age and illness, and death, for instance. Youth can maintain itself upon the level in the plenitude of its strength. But man grows older, grows weaker, and must one day die. How do things stand now with age, and illness, and death? Is the old man to peg out like an old ox drawing back into his corner, thrust out of the herd or mangled? Is the sick man to be segregated behind the high walls of hospitals, and given the merciful squirt with a hypodermic if his illness lasts too long or seems incurable? And how stand things with death? Is it the end of it all or not the end? Is there a hereafter, and of what sort? These problems, pertaining to man's very essence, now press heavily and directly on each individual man, and demand an answer. Man is now really naked and unadorned, exposed in a universe which will not support him as it does the animals, but against which he stands alone, the unfinished and imperfect being, the as yet undefined animal, as Nietzsche expressed it. One thing becomes clear: liberty, which destroys authority and levels out the hierarchy, is only made possible and given some security by the old authority. What has been destroyed still exists in the consciousness of those carrying out the destruction. While they are destroying the pillars of the old cupola, they fancy themselves to be still in the shelter of the edifice. The liberty here experienced is the liberty of transition. What is being destroyed itself still gives security to the work of destruction and those who are engaged in it. But when the level has been reached and the consciousness of the destruction of the old hierarchy dawns, the transitional liberty also begins to weaken, and anxiety mounts. 9. What is man? This question can no longer be put to another man. The point has now been reached where man in the seclusion of his own being asks himself, who am I, to what end am I living, and what is the meaning of my existence? Just as the intoxication of liberty was general and total, so now the anguish of liberty is becoming general and total. Parents, wife, and children cannot give an answer to it. The significance of the family has become too weak. One's profession, hitherto the strongest answer to this question, has been destroyed and flattened out. No human existence can still be built up thereon. Unemployment has in a brief period thrown millions of men into nothingness, and it can come upon man anew at any moment. Work itself has become mechanical and meaningless. The respect of the other man is no longer available. The material prospects are scanty and uncertain. The times in which money and property bestowed on one peace and security have long gone by. Money is often devalued, property is frequently lost. Earth flees in panic anguish through the world, without finding any security. The spirit which once lent glitter and contentment to life has fled. Who am I, to what end am I alive, and what is the meaning of my existence? It is a long path that has led us to this question. History is a record of man's continuous running away in front of himself, and of the enormous way round he has to go to get back to himself. It is ever the external, the other, the unaccustomed, towards which man is directed and before which he is able to forget himself, and it needs a mighty expenditure of time and energy to lead man to the point where he meets questions and tries to answer himself. This meeting one's own self means that there is no other way out. Questioning himself in this isolation, man soon appears to have found an answer which frees him from his insecurity. But the first direct replies soon break down, and the question falls like a stone into the depths of his soul, the circles which it sends to the surface of his life growing wider and wider. In the first stage of the historic process, when the other man was questioned, man received no answer, but something happened. The other man broke down, and was transformed into something else. Now when man questions himself he will likewise receive no answer, but something will again happen, he will himself break down, and be transformed into something else. In fact, to the question itself, which is the most natural and radical question man can put, there is no answer man can give. That indeed, is what constitutes its radical nature. He is now at the beginning of the second stage of the historic development, standing under the shadow of religion. But we are dealing here with an internal process, gripping the man again and again, and forcing him to resist the question, bringing him to a state of desperation at having no answer and knowing that he has none. The collapse of authority took decades and centuries, it embraced the destinies of millions. There is little reason to suppose that the second stage of the process will be different. The way the question is put allows us to infer how far from an answer man still is. Put in the manner of one who believes in the possibility of an answer which will release him from despair, it shows that he still cherishes the doctrine of man being the measure of all things, and is convinced that he possesses the answer in himself. This is to be at the beginning of the developmental process. And he has first to learn by experience that mankind's most important questions do not get answered in words, but in a quite other and wordless manner and from a completely different depth of being. The inner lack of security, for instance, may be overcome in a quite different manner from finding an answer in abstract words. A man can endure the internal convulsion without asking about its whence and whither. He can bear it, accept it, and suffer it without having the desire to understand clearly, knowing that there cannot be an answer capable of granting final certainty. But when there is a permanent lack of security, the convulsions which rise up every now and then from within or without do not penetrate so deep. Instead of hitting a stiff edifice of security, they strike a loosened soil, which breaks down under the impact. Here deeper forces of man's being, capable of enduring the lack of security, are awake. I am alive, I know not for how long. I die, I know not when. I travel, I know not whither. I am wondering at my being so happy. If, then, the man of today assumes that an answer to the problem of his being can be found which will relieve him of insecurity, he thereby characterizes himself as a transition man who has not yet learned that such questions cannot be answered with words, but only by an inner transformation of the man himself. The word must once again become flesh, and the way is, stand fast in uncertainty and stand up to suffering. Man is not only a being directed outwardly, who projects everything which excites him into his own little circumjacent world, in order to experience it and suffer it in an apparently alien form. He is also the being who flees from suffering, and at the end of all endurance is susceptible to change and a transformation of his being. His inner transformation is most painful to him, because it involves renunciation of certain conceptions of his being upon which he has built up his existence. It can therefore be prophesied that he will take many byways and accept many answers which promise to lead him out of his impasse and offer the semblance of peace and security. He will endeavor to re-erect broken down grades of the former hierarchy, well knowing that the conditions for them have gone. He will endeavor to create a new sham authority and a new sham hierarchy, and provide them with all means of securing acceptance, well knowing that they possess no genuine authority, but only force. There are, however, other methods of avoiding the convulsion caused by lack of security. Man can dope himself in various ways, or simply refuse to think. He can also work himself into a state of artificial intoxication. He can undertake crusades and join flagellant processions. He can stone heretics and burn witches. There is no means which a man in anguish leaves untried for tormenting himself and other people, and it can be safely prophesied that anguish will make him try everything. 10. It is one of the peculiarities of our era that the greatest pains are taken to suppress the emergence of the question which disturbs, convulses, and torments everybody. Man fears to admit his inner lack of certainty, and tries to smother it with an assurance calculated to deceive others and, in the end, himself also. It resembles the habit, also widespread, of endeavoring to transform death by painting the corpse so as to imitate life. But once the question has reared its head, it cannot be pushed aside, and since modern man lacks the inner strength to answer it, he has to suffer it in the impasse of his existence, from which he can escape only by a painful process of inner transformation. We live amid the bankruptcy of intellectual thought which has for centuries excited and absorbed Western man, and in a period of historic transition, from the last and most violent of revolutions, with its focus in the West, but stretching out thence to embrace and convulse the whole world, to a new religious event, which is coming upon us but slowly. It is true that little of the religious development yet appears. But the question, "What must I do to be saved?" addressed by the layman to the parson, seemed innocuous and proved revolutionary. And when the question about the ground and meaning of human existence is thrust back upon the individual, it will be found to have consequences of the widest scope. Spiritual affairs have their own laws, which are as infrangible as those of nature. Once the question is raised, man cannot reach a state of stability until he has mastered it. But inasmuch as it cannot be answered by logic, it drives him down into ever darker depths of his being, until he learns by painful experience that it is part of the nature of man to be unable to answer this question himself. His cognitive powers do not afford him knowledge of the meaning of his existence, but only allow him to perceive that he is an unfinished being, who can but hope to acquire perfection in the course of his development. This leads him to surrender the proposition that he is himself forsooth the measure of all things, and inclines him to modesty and humility. But modesty and humility are bridges which logically and immutably lead one over into the sphere of the religious. Man begins once more to realize that his self-satisfaction, his absoluteness, and his autonomy stand on weak foundations, and his existence cannot be based upon them. He suspects that he is subordinated to a higher power, and slowly acquires once more an understanding of his dependence. Revolution and religion are very close together, and modern man is torn between them. He overthrows what remains of authority, only to be confronted by questions which bring him back to religion. He is passing through an historic transition so vast that it can be compared only with that undergone in the first centuries of our epoch, or the transition between the Middle Ages and modern times. The division between revolution and religion in a transition age runs through each individual, and he cannot escape his historic destiny. Hence man today is a split personality. The battle is being waged within him, just as it is in the world around. Revolution which storms the cloisters, persecutes the priests, and dishonors the most holy things, appears to be manifestly opposed to God, and when it is successful, looks like a denial of God. Yet it is the instrument of His will. Even the leaders who overflow with energy and efficiency have a puppet's air, as though their movements were controlled from above. So much is recognized by de Maistre. The closer one sees the men who are clearly leaders of the revolution, he writes, the more one finds something passive and mechanical about them. It cannot be too often repeated that it is not the men who make revolutions, but revolutions which use the men. A revolution, it has been rightly said, goes by itself. The phrase means that God is clearly revealed in the event. If the worst implements are employed, it is by way of castigation and to secure improvement. It is its task to destroy the well-secured authority and the well-accommodated hierarchy which erect themselves as an impassable barrier between man and God, by which the vital exchange from above to below and from below to above are interrupted. And it is its task to re-establish the vital exchange, by driving man out of his false certainty and security, and leading him back to the uncertainty and insecurity in the midst of the universe which is an essential part of his destiny. The closer revolution draws to its goal, the more clearly and distinctly man rises up again. But the more distinctly man arises, the more clearly does the image of God reveal itself, without which he is unable to endure himself and his existence, and without which he must sink into nothingness. The questioning about the nature of man which is arising from all quarters today shows that, after the destruction of the old order and authority, man is beginning to step out into the open, and to feel himself naked before the being who rests still and silent opposite, and contemplates him. The revolution of today is not comparable with any known to us from history. The upper grades are not being attacked and destroyed from below, but it rages on the level between man, and comes to fullness inside each individual, biting immediately and deeply into man's being, and is striving towards a new man, a new world, and a new life. It is possible that revolution has a long way yet to go, that these are but the first squalls which have roared over us, to be followed by other and heavier storms. We do not know how far man has departed from God, or what he has to destroy to open the way back. We are only beginning once more to have an inkling of the nature of that opposite called God, and of the mysterious mutual and variable interrelationship between him and the soul of man, and we cannot say in what form he is to manifest himself again to us. We know as yet but the one thing, that man is again beginning to question himself, and in so doing is setting himself on the way to discovering the order in which his nature was set from the beginning, and from which he cannot possibly escape. As Donoso Cortes puts it, it was forbidden him to hold up the inevitable execution of the basic laws of the physical and moral world, laws which are the foundation of order among mankind and in the universe, that man, having departed from order through the doorway of sin, should return to order by any other way than through the gate of punishment, is something the world has not yet seen, and never will see. Punishment is God's envoy. It comes to all men, and brings to all men news of him. 11. As long as the hierarchy existed, the word possessed authority, and tradition still had power, so long could man in the West appeal to history to tell him whence he came and whither he was going. The collapse of the hierarchy brought down this authority also, which unites within itself the sum of all traditions. History has lost its grace and its liberating power of giving certainty to man. Some hundreds of generations have been conditioned by it. It provided a form before which past and present lay spread out as on a wide table, and afforded man a high degree of assurance in which to prosecute his affairs. Today one can only interpret man and the age we live in from the depths of the soul, in the place where one's destiny and future are being made, and where guilt and retribution mysteriously intertwine. The deeper one digs down into the soul of man, which is to say, the deeper man goes into his own self, the more do past and future crumple together into a living unit of the present. Time and history lose their objective quality, and centuries become as days. In the depths of man's soul time is extinguished. Events which lie centuries back are there living and effective. The path which led the man of the West to the level, as we explained earlier, began at the peak of the hierarchy, when authority lapsed into complacent autocracy and established itself as absolute and autonomous. Historically it can be dated nearly 1,000 years ago, when the strife between emperor and pope led in 1075 to the 27 Theses of Gregory VI, the Dictatus Papae. Gregory, who was called Holy Satan, claimed entire and absolute sovereignty over the Church, and set up a program which the churches in a tight ring carried into effect. Its fulfillment was crowned by the Bull Unum Sanctum of 1308. The Pope thereby assumed the place of God, and claimed to wield the spiritual sword, to rule over emperors and kings and all mankind, to be Christ's deputy on earth. From thence onwards revolution started in the countries of the West, and the leveling process and removal of the hierarchy began. The free and direct way upwards had been barred and locked. Petrus Crassus, an imperial jurist, of the time, described the newly emergent human type of the revolution. Our age has to the misfortune of all others bred a new type of man. In behavior and breeding the type is quite distinct from that of earlier periods, and one cannot tell whether nature has here taken the wrong path in creation. The revolution is typical of all that follow it. The forces released press expansively outwards in the form of intoxication, and inwardly exert a destructive force. Fire and sword were the escorts of that first revolution, which led outwards into the epoch of the Crusades, and, with the abominations of the Albigensian War, led inwards to the persecution and burning of heretics which occupied the West for centuries. With this fall of man at the peak of the hierarchy, the descent to the level began. In setting himself in the place of God, the Pope gave the signal for every class to do likewise. Why should you be God and not I? Is a question before which title deeds lose their force. To be sure, the development now took two different paths, determined by the Pope's dual position, as head of united Christendom, and recognized leader of the ecumenical world on the one hand, and as master of Rome and representative of all Italy on the other. This twin position of his dominates the course of development in the West. The two separate paths keep meeting and separating, but both lead to the same end. Man sets himself in the place of God, and thereby suffers the loss of the image of man. On the first and shorter path, the step of the Pope is of primarily national importance in the fight of Rome and Italy against the Emperor. Within the tiny limit of the Italian city-states and in a comparatively brief period, he reduces the hierarchy to the level. The movement he initiated ending logically in the course of a few centuries in the Italian Renaissance, which gave reality to the ideal image of free, autonomous and proudly autocratic man, the man-god. The Italian Renaissance laid the foundations of modern life. Today its language is spoken on the streets and in the marketplaces of our Western world. It created the ideas and works which have ever and again been imitated, completed, perfected, and brought to realization. It may therefore be regarded as the start of the modern Europe, and Renaissance man as the prototype of all those who are still disintegrating the hierarchy and have not yet reached the level. Until quite recently, modern history described the magnificent intoxication of the Renaissance, but remained silent about the despair in which it ended, the ruin of cities and people which it brought to pass, the grievous political fate of those brilliant city-states which were rubbed to pieces in the friction between France and Spain, the great powers of the time. The path from the Dictatus Papae to the collapse of the Italian Renaissance is the shorter of the two paths leading from the apex of the hierarchy down to the level. The course followed in Italy can be used as a model from which the course of the other and longer path pursued by the whole of the West can be forecast. Movement here is slower and more ponderous. Only in our day has the level been reached and the destruction of the image of man been consummated. As 400 years ago in Venice, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and Rome men stared into the void, so their descendants in Berlin, Paris, Brussels, Copenhagen, and Zurich do today. Then the shadows of the two great powers, France and Spain, fell across the gaily colored life of the Renaissance. Today it is the shadows of the two great world powers, America and Russia, which fall on the multicolored gaiety of life in Europe. The might of the condottiere is drawing to its end. The colors of the artist and the verses of the poet are drying up. The funeral pyre of Savonarola begins to flicker. The smug autocracy introduced by Gregory as the head of Christianity was answered by Luther in his 95 Theses. This reply, given in 1517, came nearly half a millennium later. With it began the Second Revolution in the West, the claim to sovereignty and absolutism of the next lowest grade, initiating the gay autocracy of kings and princes by the grace of God. First the Pope had put himself in the place of God and eliminated the emperor, and then the next grade asked, "Why you and not me?" The man from Wittenberg made himself the spokesman of this fermentation within the hierarchy, and fought to recreate every man's direct free access above. But the avalanche, which had started rolling from the apex, was waxing greater and beginning to roll over the gradations of the hierarchy. The next below, the kings and princes, took the words out of his mouth and employed them to establish their own sovereignty. The place of God the Father began to be taken by the father of his country as the highest dignitary, who was at pains to make use of clothes, lace, gold sticks, and a flowing wig all round his face, to the end that at least outwardly he should look the part. The process continues in the West and repeats itself with monotonous uniformity. Every grade which has laid the foundations of its own sovereignty is challenged by the grade below, and the questioning continues until collapse comes. And each country where such a class change occurs becomes the pioneer for all the other Western countries. In England, the country gentlemen of 1648 questioned the existing order, and established the sovereignty of the British gentry. In France, the citizen world of 1787 questioned it, and established the glib autocracy of the Third Estate, the bourgeoisie. In Russia, the last class questioned it in 1917, and established the autonomy of the workers, the proletariat. Each revolution displaced one grade of the hierarchy and established the next below on the tatters of the authority which had been torn down. Each took the hierarchy a bit lower, but the whole process began with the man nearest God, placing himself in God's place, thereby giving all other classes a pattern to follow. It is unnecessary to indicate the similarities in all these revolutions. Each has its crusades and persecution of heretics within them. Everybody talks alike and takes the same course. Each becomes representative for the West and drags all other countries down with it. It is only because of its current news value that we mention the phenomenon of fascism, an episode of 2 brief decades. The numerically not unimportant little middle class, the third and a half estate, which was rolling down to the level, was in danger of being smothered between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And deceived in its expectations, fascism was its attempt to set itself similarly in the place of God and to comport itself with complacent autocracy. Clipped in between the third and the fourth estate, this section of the population endeavored to force its way forward, and, feeling itself threatened from above and from below, displayed at the same time both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary characteristics and petered out as a brief episode. None the less it provided a sign and a warning that the demonic powers set loose by the collapse of authority had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. The Russian Revolution, that of the proletariat, is political and social, the total world revolution which is to embrace the whole of mankind. In it the level has finally been reached. For the countries of the West, out of whose hands the doctrine of man being the measure of all things is slipping, it is, however, only yesterday's revolution, and is speedily losing its proselytizing force. For revolution lasts only so long as man is not seeking to establish himself, so long, that is to say, as he is drawing his strength from the destruction of the hierarchy. Once the hierarchy has been reduced, the intoxication which sustained him fades out. Thus, from the standpoint of the West, the Russian Revolution only completed the overthrow of the hierarchy, and its significance must be sought within the framework of the 9 centuries of dissolution. For the country which carried it through, however, it opened a door for her entry as a world power in an epoch dominated by the conception of world unity. Many still at home in the historical past will be painfully troubled by the thought that it is not Europe which is bringing a unified world culture to perfection. The rise of the 2 great powers of our era certainly means the elimination of Europe from the major sphere of political influence. But the really important question before mankind is not if, and how, world unity can be attained, but whether man will really find assurance and security in a culturally united world, or will, indeed, be able to live in it at all. The fact that the question about the nature of man is most pressingly felt by man in the West, and that he is more or less at home in a state of desperation, indicates that he will be the first to face the spiritual event which is slowly approaching us, and will assume a leading role in a new epoch concerned with the transformation of man himself. Representatives of authority during the past 9 centuries are still living round him. The Pope speaks to him. Kings and princes address him. There are still country estates where the nobility reside. The bourgeoisie is still living in its villas. But the hierarchy today resembles one of those skyscrapers burnt out during the war. The skeleton of girderwork remains, a relic from the past, while life roars on the level through the streets and over the market squares. Below, one great chapter of Western history ends with autonomous and self-sufficient man who has set himself in the place of God, but who has to find an answer to the question as to the nature and meaning of human existence. At the conclusion of the new chapter, which has only just been begun, will be found the answer to this question, so long as the Godman has not in the meantime succeeded in bringing us to the end of all history, thanks to his self-sufficient autocracy and material power.